you got a taste from last week about a theme that we have in this semester where we try to understand what is credible and what is not credible. So we already understood that even us researchers in academia, us students at HEU, even we have biases, even we have weaknesses. How do we know? Because even the great minds that gave us behavioral economics and judgment decision making, we have Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Prize winner, right? Recently passed away, that warned the world in 1970s to be very careful when you rely on small samples. What did we see? That he himself fell into the trap that he warned the world about when he published a book with a chapter, a very problematic chapter about social priming. In addition, we saw very confusing case study with a YouTuber versus a UCLA professor, academia versus social media. Who won? The YouTuber won. UCLA professor was not humble, did not check himself, did not take a moment and a few bucks in order to verify his theories. So we have confirmation bias, outcome bias, hindsight bias, publication bias. We have all sorts of issues in academia. And the nice thing about judgment decision making is that actually we can study ourselves. We can inform ourselves. We can do better ourselves before we go to others. So some of you, very small group, are taking 2 courses with me. This is one course. The other course is Advanced Social Psychology. And over there, we complement one another. So they're also looking at how to evaluate, how to know whether something is credible or not. So you, if you want, can go and have a look at the recording. I just uploaded this from yesterday about some of the stuff that we've been discussing over there. And today, to supplement what I gave yesterday, I'm going to talk about the credibility of the biggest names and the best sellers of judgment decision making in the world. So we tackled Daniel Kahneman in the biggest ever behavioral economics book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But today, we have a few more books to tackle, so many books to tackle, and we want to know, are they credible or not credible? Because if you go to the HKU library, or if you go to the HKU bookstore, and you go to the behavioral economics or the judgment decision making or the psychology, these things will come up. So definitely predictably irrational nudge is a big one. We're going to talk about another Nobel Prize winner that has worked with Daniel Kahneman that brought psychology into economics. So yeah, we tackle Daniel Kahneman. So we realized there's at least one problematic chapter there. But now we have 3 other books by very prominent people. Dan Ariely, who has heard of Dan Ariely? Some of you? 1, 2, okay, yeah. Very famous name. We'll talk about him. Then we have Nudge, Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize winner of 2017. Then we've got other very prominent people like Eric Johnson. So first I'll start with an introduction of Richard Thaler. So if you go to Wikipedia, you Google this guy, very prominent guy, has revolutionized economics. So now economics is no longer economics. Behavioral economics became economics because all economists now know that you need to factor in that people do not act following the rational model. So we're not rational agents. We're not computers. We don't compute. We don't know all the values. And he did this from within, from the University of Chicago, where all the big economists told him that he is wrong. Psychology is not serious. Economists need to do things a different way. We've got models and equilibrium, demand, supply, and all of that. And everybody knows everything in markets are optimized. But Richard Thaler came within the University of Chicago, addressed everything, and brought the psychology into economics and revolutionized everything. So big impact together with Daniel Kahneman.
Now, a look at the winner of this year's Nobel Prize in Economics announced today. Richard Thaler is a professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. The award acknowledged his groundbreaking work in establishing the field of behavioral economics, which blends psychology with economics to better understand human decision-making. We start with a little bit of background from our economics correspondent, Paul Solman. It's part of his weekly series, Making Sense.
In Chicago's Millennium Park 2.5 years ago, Richard Thaler, the academic revolutionary who won this year's Nobel Prize for insisting for decades now that his field, economics, is wedded to a distorted view of human behavior. Economics teaches that we're all rational maximizers, mathematical machines who use our big brainy heads to carefully calculate every decision as we strive to reach concrete objectives. But look, Thaler explained.
After the '87 crash, when the market fell 20% in a day, and the internet bubble, when the NASDAQ went from 5,000 to 1,400, and then the real estate bubble, which led to a financial crisis from which we're still trying to extricate ourselves, the idea that markets work perfectly is no longer tenable.
Thaler has been running his revolution from inside the belly of the beast, the University of Chicago, which boasts 28 other Nobel laureates practiced in traditional economics. Collectively, they've created what's known as the Chicago School, predicated on the perfect efficiency of markets, in which prices rationally reflect all available information. But Thaler started noticing market irrationality early in his career as an economist.
The market would go up in January. It would go up on Fridays, down on Mondays. It would go up on the day before holidays. None of this made any sense.
But it was only when Thaler began doing experiments and publishing them that doctrinaire economists, whom he calls econs, began to admit some of the error of their ways. Take the concept of sunk costs, time and money you've already spent. An econ assumes all of us know when to quit, to cut our losses, to move on. This group of Cameroonian students at first seemed to act just as economics would predict.
Suppose you bought tickets to go to a concert over here at this fancy band show, $40 each. And the group is okay, but then it starts to rain. How long do you think you're going to stick around this concert?
Not much.
Not much. Not much.
But what if the sunk cost had been much higher?
How many of you would have a different decision about staying or leaving if it was $500 as opposed to $40? Every single one of you.
I have to make my money worth it.
You have to make your money worth it.
Yeah.
And your point here?
Well, economists would say, how much you paid for the ticket? Tough luck. If it's $40 or $500,
doesn't matter.
You should just decide whether the music is worth the annoyance of the rain.
In the past few years,
I'll just say that last year, or is it 2 years ago already, we ran a replication, a well-powered replication of this specific sunk cost study, and it was successfully replicated among many of other stuff by Richard Thaler. So this specific thing, the demonstration that he's talking about here, I know that replicates also in a between design when we give this to different people and compare between them.
Thaler's behavioral economic insights have been applied by governments around the world, including ours. And how did he feel about being called the inventor of behavioral economics?
One guy can't create a field, but you can get people thinking.
And so he has. This is economics correspondent Paul Saul.
So I was really curious when I started to know about him, like, what is your number one contribution to the world? Can you give me like one example that would explain anything in your research? And I was very, very surprised by his example. So the example in the previous video, great, solid, looks good. I verified this myself. How about this one?
Let me give you an illustration of a nudge. It's funny. It's one paragraph in our book, but it's by far the most famous.
By far the most.
Book. It turns out some genius, an economist, in fact, allegedly at least, an economist who works for the Amsterdam International Airport, Schiphol, got the brilliant idea to etch the image of a housefly in the urinals in the men's bathrooms at the airport. This image of a housefly, it looks extremely realistic. You can see a picture of it on our website, nudges.org. And it's located just near the drain. Now, it turns out that men, when they're taking care of their business, they're not fully attending to the task at hand. But, and I'm sure there's an evolutionary explanation for this, if you give them a target, they will aim. And according to the people who run the airport, spillage has been reduced by 80%. Now, that housefly has become my favorite illustration of a nudge.
Wow, so much to unpack here. Many of you are female, so I'll explain. Many of you are also male and did not understand why when they go into a urinal, there's a fly there. He's to blame this guy. So a big problem in men's bathrooms is that you go in and there's a urinal. So women have to pile up, and there's a whole thing about women not having urinals and having to wait longer, and there's longer lines and all this, but men can take care of this pretty fast. Just go in. Problem is that it tends to backfire in all sorts of different ways, and people don't aim, and there's like spillage, what he calls like people missing the target or things splashing back. So seems like a small problem, big problem. Spillage in airport, especially because a lot of people go through there. Even at HKU here, we're very blessed because we've got people like wiping the floors all the time. But in men's bathroom, this is a big thing. Now, of all the accomplishments, of everything that he has done, the Nobel Prize, all of the things that he has ever done policy on, you ask him, what is the biggest example of a nudge? And this is what he comes up with. Now, what have you noticed? What questions do you have to ask in order to understand this better? Now that you understand the context, you've heard him explain this. Do you have any questions for Richard? What would you like to know about this experiment? He's talking about an experiment with a genius, an economist, in fact. What would you like to ask him in order to know whether this is a credible evidence? Any questions? Yes, please. Very good question. How do you measure the spillage? Can you imagine the person who was actually measuring the spillage? How to measure spillage? Very, very good question. Yes, please.
I believe when people get more educated, they have more consciousness to keep the place more type T.
Okay.
So it is the more the area that has more rural or less being known, maybe more dirty than the areas that he took. Measure.
Yes, could be. So you're talking about generalizability. Does this generalize to other places? Also, you can ask all sorts of things about, for example, Schiphol Airport is a big airport. Was it done on all the urinals? Some of the urinals? Did you randomize this? Did you look at different people coming in? Perhaps different people come from different countries. Perhaps they use this in a different way. Who knows? Lots of questions. And one of this is, how accurate is this? And can this generalize to something else? Very good. Anything else? What other questions? The very basic idea is a little bit puzzling. Why is it a fly? Why would I want to aim at a fly? Why would this divert attention? Where to put this? A urinal is a big place. It's not exactly on the drain. It's a little bit to the side. Did somebody try to manipulate this as well? Is this really the top most urgent thing in order to implement behavioral economics? Right? But this has become the most famous example. Why? Because Richard Thaler likes to make jokes and likes to explain to women the context of urinals for men. So this comes up again and again. Now, I had some questions, and I kept asking Richard Thaler on Twitter because he's active on Twitter, but he does not respond to me because I'm very, very small and he's very, very big. But sometimes, I have questions. I ask people questions, especially if they make themselves available on a platform like Twitter. He does not respond, but other people do respond. So what are my questions? Here are my questions. Just wondering, Thaler and Sunstein, who wrote the book Nudge, whether the Schiphol Airport urinal fly nudge story has ever been empirically tested or replicated in some scholarly work. Has this been published? We keep talking about this, but can we see the evidence? Has the data been shared? Who is this genius? Can we just talk to him? Can we verify what happened over there? So people always think of that story, but we don't really know what happened over there. Now, this guy here is a reporter, and he said, I've been trying to track down what happened with that story for a very long time, but I can't seem to get any details about who did this, why did they do this, what were the findings. The only mention of this ever is by Sunstein and Thaler in the book Nudge. And then I go further than this. So I wrote, for example, I don't think that there's anything done on this. And then I gave an example of all sorts of things on how people implement policy. People change all kinds of stuff. So I think happened to you, if you're a man, that you went into the bathroom and then you saw different things. Sometimes it's a fly. Sometimes it's a soccer field. It's like a goalie. You can play with this while you're doing your stuff. People do all sorts of things with this. Obviously, somebody had to put it there. Somebody invested some money in this. Do we know this work or it does not work? So I had a lot of questions and I talked to this journalist and I tried to understand. I've been asking Thaler for long enough that I was pretty sure that he ignores me altogether. However, at some point, he started to change the way that he's presenting this. And the last one that I saw in 2021, when he was talking about, suddenly he changed the way that he talks about this. And now he says this.
International airport. And some genius etched the image of a housefly.
Yeah.
And they report, we've been unable to get the data.
Unable to get the data.
This may not replicate.
Might not replicate.
But they claim spillage has been reduced by 80%. If any of you are The parents of young boys, I hear Cheerios.
Cheerios, maybe better.
Can
Fly.
serve the same purpose.
Just etch on your toilet, just put a Cheerio because he's heard that this. So this is his Nobel Prize winning talk where he's presenting this. Now he refers to this finding, the biggest finding from Nudge, the one that is the biggest example. Now he's talking about it's unverified. We've heard, they're claiming, we don't know, 80%. Now suddenly there's 80%, unverified. So at least he's saying this might not replicate, unverified. But really, as a Nobel Prize winning person who communicates Nudge to the world, when you're giving a talk about behavioral economics, and this is the one example that you want to use, is this really the one thing that you should be talking about? So you think this is a rare example? It really is not, because I've heard him on podcasts again and again. You can see that I follow the big names, and I've heard him again and again talk about these things. I'll just give you one example. Choiceology, very good podcast about all that is behavioral economics. Katie Milkman really knows her stuff. Here's what he has to say.
The most famous example of a nudge probably is that they etched the image of houseflies in the urinals in the Amsterdam airport and reported, no one has been able to replicate this, but they reported that spillage was reduced by 80%. So the lesson here is if you give a man a target, he will aim. A nudge is anything that attracts our attention and changes our behavior without changing monetary incentives or restricting choices.
And do you have favorite examples of nudges besides the urinal?
Besides the urinal
that have been
What else is there?
What else?
You know, the behavioral insights team and the UK government and some of the work they've done.
So it would be funny if it weren't so sad, because when she actually asks him for all the other stuff that she knows and was involved in, about all the great stuff that behavioral economics gave to the world, what is the reaction? They laugh about this, but what else is there? It's the urinals and the flies and the Cheerios that we've not been able to verify with the 80% spillage reduction. So I think we should be asking questions of our greatest minds and what is it that they communicate to us. So this is the main message that I have to you. Even great minds with Nobel Prizes talk nonsense sometimes and make absolutely no sense. So even when you see somebody saying in the news, social media, Nobel Prize winner says this, it doesn't mean that this is credible, because you can see how some of the academics behave. They don't take science seriously. Perhaps they've done some great work that led to the Nobel Prize, but seriously, this is not the way that we should be doing science and not the way that we should be communicating science to you, to the public. So my message to you is that even when you hear a finding like this, that is the biggest thing in behavioral economics and the book Nudge, I urge you, check, where did this come from? Who is behind the study? Where is the data? Has they been pre-registered? Has they've done replications? Have they been able to generalize this? So be very, very careful, even when you've got somebody who's very, very prominent. Okay, so this is one good example from a Nobel Prize winner of economics. So when he says stuff like, this is the example of good design, this is not good design. So there's lots of issues that now that we've discussed about this for a very long time, so you can ask all of these questions. What means that there's a good design? What needs to happen with a nudge for it to be a good nudge? How do we define these things? So don't just take things for granted. Always put your scientist hat and ask questions. What is happening here? What is he telling us? How can we test this? How can we falsify this to know that this is not happening? In fact, did you test different targets? Did you test different placements? How was this conducted? How was this measured? And so forth. So you'll get the hang of it to start asking questions. Here, there's another question to be asked, because here's another big book by a big name, and his name is Eric Johnson, The Elements of Choice. And you can see here, also very, very impactful, not on the same level as Richard Thaler or Daniel Kahneman, but still, compared to a lot of us researchers that have very small impact, a lot of engagement with the academic community, right? And this is considered to be the Bible for how to do choice architecture, how to do nudges, how to implement behavioral economics in the field. So I've listened to this. It just came out 2 years ago. So during the pandemic, I was doing some hikes and listening to this. In almost every chapter, I had a lot of questions because I do research on this all the time. And just so happens that I, together with you, HKU students, conducted a lot of replications of this work. So I was very curious to see how he's going to present all kinds of stuff over there. So I'm just going to present to you piece of video. So he's talking about default effects. Maybe I have the example here. Yeah. So I'll play the video first, and then I'll explain what the big finding is. And the same finding is also appearing in Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's Nudge book. So both of them talk about this one big finding, and I'll let him explain.
Let me step back. There's a challenge here just for a second, which is if you're writing a book which you want it to communicate to lots of people and not get into the weeds, how do you describe replicable science and how do you get people to think about it? One thing I do is obviously I try and pick examples from literatures that, we know will replicate. So I think that's a really important and a challenge because not by definition, not all the cute studies are necessarily studies that, there's lots of literature. And actually, by the way, when something is speculative, I try and say that. But I also do the same thing I do with my students, which is when I teach.
I'm just going to give you some context. Katie Milkman, the same Katie Milkman from the podcast, also has an author series where she interviews people about their books. So she was asking him, especially given all the interactions with Richard Thaler, about replicable science. How do you describe replicable science? And he starts to say, how does he know whether something that he did replicates or not? And how does he work on this with his students?
Charts architecture, which say, here's a thing called a forest plot. And all it does is say, here's every study we found in the area, and here's what the average effect is. And also gives you little ideas of how big the sample was and how reliable it is. So let me give a concrete example, defaults. So Dan Goldstein and I did some research on defaults in agreeing to be an organ donor. And that had a huge effect, 50%. And
okay, so he is describing something that I'll show you in next slide. He's talking about defaults and how defaults impact whether you're going to sign up as an organ donor so that after you die, if you die, you donate all your organs. So obviously, as a society, we need organ donors urgently because otherwise the people who need these organs don't have organs. And actually, it's very, very sad that the organ donation levels across all the countries in the world is very, very low. So any kind of nudge or change in the choice architecture that leads to higher donations, higher signatures registering as organ donors is very, very important for society, important for all of us, so that if we're sick, that there's going to be organs that can be implanted in us. So he's talking about the need to look at all of the effects. He's giving us one of the biggest effects that he knows about. And this is the studies that he has done on organ donations and defaults. If you change the defaults, then organ donation changes, okay? He says, huge effect.
So lots of my students say, oh, all I have to do is change the default and I'll get 50% increase. There are even studies that do better. There are some very nice studies that have people choosing between green energy, sustainable energy, and non-sustainable energy. They show 80, 90% changes.
80, 90%.
I don't want students, I don't want people who read the book to think that's typical. So it turns out when you do the meta-analysis, you can figure out what's the average size. And it turns out it's about 25%. But what's
okay, so he described two studies, one with organ donation, 50%, already huge effect. If we can impact things using default by 50%, that's incredible. But he also says that there's a study that shows that you can shift people's preferences in terms of sustainable choices to combat climate change and global warming. And over the impact is even 80%, right? But this seems too much. It could be that there's a variability. So he's saying, let's use something called a meta-analysis. And we talked a little bit about a meta-analysis, but a meta-analysis in very short is looking at all of the literature together, aggregating this into one analysis, and then using some kind of statistics methods in order to give you a conclusion. And the conclusion takes into consideration that there's a variability in the effect sizes. So some of them are big, some of them are small. If you aggregate this according to all sorts of things like sample size, then you'll get the average effect, which he says here is much smaller than this. It's about 25, it's about half of the defaults.
Important is you sort of see what are the factors that make it bigger or larger, which if you're a user, if you're a designer, is useful. Other literatures, like how many options to present somebody, it turns out it's I won't say it's a mess, but I'll say it's sometimes really good and sometimes actually hurts. And what the science that's left to be done is understanding which is which.
Yeah, so he's referring to another big finding, and perhaps you've heard of this TED Talk about choice overload. So people, when they have too many choices, they get stuck and they don't know how to choose, right? So choice overload seemed to be at the beginning some big finding, flashy finding in our top journals. But then after a while, we realized there's lots of complexity there. Sometimes it leads to being stuck. Sometimes it actually helps. So a bit more messy. So he's saying, unlike the defaults, where you've got organ donations and you've got stuff like sustainability, that have an average effect of 25, which is pretty great, can go all the way to 80% change. The stuff that is more messy and not as credible, because we can see in meta-analysis that choice overload has some problems. Okay? So this is already a lot more cautious and humble than how I typically hear Richard Thaler talk about things. So a big improvement. Now let me explain to you what organ donations is about. So this is actually, not a lot of us can get our papers into Science. Science is a big journal. It's the #1 considered the most high impact factor and most reputable. So in 2003, you can see the title, Do Defaults Save Lives? And there's a number of studies there, but one of them is a description of what happens with defaults in different countries. And what you can see from this figure over here is the difference between opt-in and opt-out. So over here, in countries like Denmark, Netherlands, UK, and Germany, you have to opt in. You're not automatically enrolled as an organ donor. Therefore, you can see the rates are lower than 10, 30, 20, about 10. So very, very low rates of signing up to be organ donors. But there are some countries where by default, you are signed in to be an organ donor. And what is the registration rate for those? You can see over here, places that are very similar. So Netherlands is just next to Belgium. Here Netherlands is 30%. Belgium, very close to 100%. You can see other things like UK and Germany, very, very low, but they're just next to France. And then you can see this is very, very high. So it's not entirely clear. Sweden versus Denmark, Scandinavians, it's not really clear what is the difference between these countries, aside from the fact that the default is different. So this is a big finding, one of 3 big findings in that Science paper. And this has been communicated again and again, both in Eric Johnson's book and in Nudge. So Richard Thaler refers to this again and again. And the conclusion from this is that if we only change the defaults, let's say, for example, in Hong Kong tomorrow, the chief executive decides that everybody is going to be enrolled by default to be organ donors, then we're going to shift from very low rates to very close to 100% rates. What do you think? Makes sense to you? Any thoughts about this intervention? What questions do you have as scientists? Big finding, best journal that we have in terms of reputation and impact factor, Science. Repeated again and again in books, some of them acknowledged by a Nobel Prize, right? What questions should we be asking ourselves? The data is solid. We know that these are the defaults in these countries, and we know that this is the organ donation enrollment rate. So the data here is solid. There's no question about urinals and spillage and how do we measure this. This is actually measured correctly, but maybe we have other questions. What other questions can we ask? Yes, please. Terrific. Awareness. Do they really know that they enrolled in this? Now, try and explain to us, why is awareness important here? Let's say that they're not aware. What's the consequences of this?
Not really measuring that it makes people more willing to donate. It's just that they are automatically willing.
Exactly. So the book is called Choice, and we're talking about a choice architecture. But if there's no awareness, is this really a choice? And what does this choice reflect? And what is the consequence of that choice? Very good question. Thank you. Any other? Yes?
Just a snapshot. I wonder, like, what if this is just one day after the policy was published and not many people, especially old people,
Good.
Or is it
Very good.
20 years after the policy that people are just...
Yes. Very good. You want to see the trend over time? You want to see whether this generalizes? So I like your thinking about, is this just here now, this specific thing, but what happens over time? So what does this represent? This is from 2003. What happened in 2004? What happened this year? Does this still remain? And then what does this capture? What happens in other countries? Did they choose these countries? So many countries around the world. Why these countries? Can we see all of them? Very good. Any other questions? What other questions do you have? So many things that we should be worrying about and asking here, right? Anything else? Okay, think about this. The more examples that you'll see, the more questions that you'll have. But I really want you to try as much as possible when you see stuff in the media, but also when you see stuff in scientific articles, that you don't just take it for granted that everything is great. You need to ask questions. You need to doubt things. You need to challenge the people who give these findings. In addition, he was talking about a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is very, very important. And I'll share with you 2 meta-analyses. One of them, Eric Johnson, is actually a member, one of the group that did this. So for example, here, Eric Johnson, I think this is his wife. So she's also a very famous academic. So they did this with John here, and they published this together. And their conclusion, when you do an entire meta-analysis of all of the defaults, you can see a Cohen's d. So they looked at 58 default studies, pulled together 73,000 people. So this is already a lot more credible than some unknown stuff in Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, right? So here there's a systematic way of looking at a lot of studies with huge samples, at the end 73,000 people, and at the end then conclude that the influence of defaults is a Cohen's d of 0.68. Now, you should know, you'll get a tutorial about effect sizes and what kind of ways to compare this. What is a Cohen's d of 0.68? We should ask ourselves to inform ourselves, because we're students at HKU, to know what is the Cohen's d of 0.68. And I should tell you that a default effect of 0.68 is considered to be very large. When we have things in social psychology that are Cohen's d of half of that, 0.35, we already consider this to be a medium solid effect. Not so much about consistency, but in terms of it's noticeable. Depends on how you do this. 0.68 is very noticeable, but reasonable. It's not completely over the top. So it seems like something here. If really default effect has a meta-analysis showing 0.68 Cohen's d, then that is magnificent. So we want to verify this, and lucky for us, we have another meta-analysis that looked not only about default, but looked at all the nudges together. So when we look at the one over here at the left, I don't know how much you can see and how much you can read into this, but this is what a meta-analysis looks like. You can see the aggregation of everything. 0 means no effect. And you can see the confidence intervals. If the confidence intervals do not touch 0, then it means that there's a significant effect, the p-value lower than 0.05. And then the length of the confidence intervals is the error rate. So how much do they differ, the different studies? And then the thing in the middle is the sample size. So the bigger the box or the bigger the diamond, the more evidence there is behind that. So you can see that all of these deviate from 0. So it seems like all of these nudges seem to work very well. Reminders and commitment and consequences and composition, all of these seem to work. Which one works the best? Defaults. How much? 0.62. So we've got two meta-analyses by two big teams, one showing 0.68, one showing 0.62. Seems like they're converging. And you can already get the sense the default effect is considered to be one of the strongest nudges out there. So this seems important, and it seems to support what Eric Johnson is saying. So not only do we have the opt-in, opt-out countries, but also on the individual level, it seems like people react to defaults. Do you have any questions about this? What kind of questions would you like to ask about these two studies? Let's put scientist hat on. Let's put a critical mindset. What would you like to know about these two studies? Any questions that you have? Seems solid, right? When we look for scientific evidence, this is typically the process that we go through. We look for meta-analyses. We try to have more than one, two different groups looking at something. And then if they converge, we typically tend to say, this looks good. Looks much better than the Schiphol Airport, Netherlands urinal flight. We're in a much better position. Now we know that there's a nudge that works. Okay? But what questions should we be asking here? Yes, please. How were they selected? What literature is this? Was this systematic? Did they go through everything? Right? Very good. What kind of things were you thinking in terms of what studies? What especially things are you curious about? Yes, very good. So if we don't know how they selected the studies, it could be that they did systematic search of the literature, but only the stuff that supports their claim. This tends to be the stuff that is published, typically by this group, because this group is very prolific. They publish a lot of stuff. However, it could be that a lot of people, like me, from an unknown place, like HKU, conduct studies but don't find these effects. And then when we submit this to journals, they say, what are you talking about? Eric Johnson and Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize, published these things, reject. So when we do a meta-analysis, one of the questions that you need to ask yourself, what are they aggregating? Are they aggregating only what's published or what's published by their group? Or are they aggregating everything? And everything means also the unpublished findings, the thesis, the stuff that was rejected from the journal. So how do we do this in a meta-analysis? We issue a call. We go to everybody on every possible forum and say, do you have file drawer studies that don't show an effect? that have not been published, please share this with us. And then hopefully we can get a complete understanding of the entire literature, the stuff that was published, but also the stuff that was not published. But I can tell you, I do a lot of meta-analysis. I teach how to do meta-analysis. Getting people to share their file drawer is very, very complicated. Why? Cognitive biases. We're very, very ashamed of our failures. We don't want to communicate to others that our papers were rejected or that we couldn't replicate something that is so obvious and so strong. So we don't share this. Even when we contact people who we know, heard in a conference, word of mouth, we heard that they have a failed application, they're like, no, we don't want to share, we don't want to get attention, we don't want to upset the big names. So there's also prestige, right? So we have cognitive biases and we have issues with the big names, the Nobel Prize winners. So I'll just leave this out there and I'll come back to the meta-analysis in a few, okay? Now, once again, the same talk in 2021, when he started talking about, this might not replicate, suddenly I hear him talking about this famous study from 2003 on the default effect. And what is he talking? What is he reporting? A completely opposite effect. And here is what he has to say and explain about this.
It is not signed some form. Now, most of you are young. Imagine what inference your parents would take from your failure to fill in some form. It is not signed some form.
Sorry, just wanted to pause this for a second. Exactly the point that you're making. The people who actually make the decisions about whether the organs are harvested and go to victims, to people who need the organs, the people who make the decisions are not the deceased, they're deceased. Who makes the decision? The family makes the decision, right? And the question that they ask is exactly what you asked. Were they aware that they're giving away their organs? And when we say, no, we're sorry, it was the default, what do they take from that? Oh, this was not a choice. So if people are in opt-in, and the family hears, oh, they opted in order to become organ donors, oh, he or she really wanted to be organ donors, therefore we should donate. But what happens when we give them the default and it's out of their awareness? The family says, he didn't choose this, she didn't choose this. Of course we're not going to donate. So what happens? Complete opposite. It's a complete reversal. It's unbelievable. And here's what he has to say about this.
Now, most of you are young. Imagine what inference your parents would take from your failure to fill in some form. Probably none. And that would probably be accurate, right? Our failures of omission are not very telling about our underlying preferences. Well, does presumed consent save lives? No.
No, it does not.
So the bar on the graph is organs transplanted per 100,000 deaths in opt-in.
Look at this graph. Opt-in, opt-out. It's exactly the opposite from that. Not only does it not save lives, it creates a big issue. It reduces the actual organ donation. Communicating that this saves lives, you need to change defaults. You're going to get 80%, 50%. What happens at the end? Awareness. Very important, because cognitive biases, we need to understand people's cognition and the decision-making in order to understand whether this really has impact. They measured the wrong thing at the end. Here's the real graph. This is the real graph. That's unbelievable.
In countries, the one on the right is opt-out countries. The higher is better. This is the real graph. It's not famous.
Not famous.
But this tells us the right answer.
But this tells us the right answer. What questions do you have now? Did anybody go back to the science paper in order to change the science paper? Did somebody go back to Eric Johnson's book in order to change the book? So a lot of questions to ask, because these papers still get cited, these books still get cited. And it's amazing to see the headlines that came out of that. So we need to explain this to the public. We convince them that this works and this is great. Actually, because of that paper, a lot of countries started to do this opt-out. They started to change their defaults. But what we started noticing, because of this change, actually, the donations at the end of organs did not rise. If anything, they went down. So what you asked, over time, different countries, very good questions to ask. Should we be implementing this before we really understand what this means, testing this over time, looking at everything that's not just these countries, understanding not just that measure that they chose for their science paper, but actually what happens at the end when this decision is made by the families. right? So mind-blowing stuff. You can ask for a lot of confirmations, so you can see me once again engaging with Richard Thaler. He does not reply to me, only to more famous people. But I want to say, for example, here's an example of him replying to somebody who objects to how this whole story was done and telling Richard Thaler, you were wrong in Nudge to tell the entire world to do this. How does Richard Thaler react to this? Which is exactly what we say in the book. Which book? Turns out that last year, they had an updated version of the book. They called it the final version, where they updated the section on that. Of course, millions of copies have already been sold with Nudge, not the final version. Now, if you want the update, you need to buy the new book. But then, what does he say? Try reading before trashing? Is this how a Nobel laureate needs to react to criticism? Very justified criticism, because I was also blown away by this. At the very least say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We tried to work on this. Let's work on this together. Thank you for communicating. Trashing? This is a scientific discourse. If our Nobel Prize winners, the ones that we all look up to, behave like this on Twitter, then we're in a very tight situation. This is not a good look for academia. And then I reply, because I feel like I must, in order to say, but this is exactly your problem because you have not corrected this sufficiently. One YouTube video that I happen to find is not the way that you communicate this to the entire world. You should go on all these TED Talks, on all these headlines, and then you should say, actually, we fooled you. This is not the right thing. The right thing is actually this. But this has not been done. So a lot of engagement on Twitter. You can see some of the action in the background. Some of it is really drama. You can do a telenovela on these kinds of things. Now, I want to ask you, what kind of reaction would you want from us, from professors, from Nobel Prize winners? And then I'll tell you what is it that I did. But what would you expect of academics? What would be the right reaction to this kind of thing? You found something in 2003, you communicated this to the world, you got a Nobel Prize, 2 books came out of this, then you realize that actually, when you look at the bottom line, it's the opposite direction. What would you expect would happen? What do you want us to do? What would you do if you were in the field or in academia and then you found out that this kind of thing happened? What would you expect? Any expectations? You are our bosses. You pay my salary. You fund my research. You, through your taxes, the taxpayers, you can tell me what to do. If you don't speak up, if you don't demand better of us, then this is what's going to happen with Nobel Prize winners. This is how academics are going to treat you. Any expectations, any questions, any things that you want us to change? Think about it, okay? I'll tell you what I decided to do about it. So on my website, there's a section, and it's called Check Me, Replicate Me, Corrections and Replications of My Work. And actually, we don't do this enough. I wish that more people would be like Veritasium and the UCLA professor that would put money where their work is. But actually, I want you to check my work. It's not only that I want you to check my work. I will pay you if you find mistakes in my work because I want to be right. I want to get closer to the truth. If you come to me and you say, Professor, I found a mistake, then I'm not going to reduce your grade, kick you out of my class, be angry at you. No need to fear hierarchy. Academia is a place where criticism should be mainstream. We should all be open to criticism and we should reward this kind of behavior. So actually, in my courses, many of the times, some of the assignments, people check my work. So almost every year, those students check the work of my replications with the students from the previous year. A little bit embarrassing, but very glad to report that HKU students found mistakes in my work with the HKU students, which I'm very grateful for. And I even had to pay a lot of money in order to compensate for that. So here's an example. I can't remember which year was this with K. Huh? What second year? Like 2 years ago, right? 21. Yeah, in 21. So Katie, she's now in Toronto. She found a minor mistake, but then Team Purple here found a major mistake, and I said that I'm going to compensate $50 for a major mistake. So not only do they get like a good grade for finding mistakes in my work, but they also get money for it. It's more than this because I give a choice. So actually, if you go to my website, you see you can either earn $50 for finding a major mistake or $5 for something that's a small mistake. But if you decide to donate this, to give well to the most effective charities in the world, then I will match it and I will double it, okay? So actually at the end, this cost me $250. But small price to pay for having my article corrected before it's published, so that when it's actually out there, this is solid evidence. So what is the right reaction from Richard Thaler when somebody says, but you need to correct your research, you need to update the world, you need to think about maybe there's a mistake here. You've done a mistake, you need to communicate. What is the right reaction? Thank you. How can I work with you in order to make this happen? This is the right way to do things in academia. Not to dismiss, not to fight, not to diss each other, right? So this is how I feel like we should do this. And again, so the students decided to donate this, and then I matched it and doubled it, and then we gave this to GiveWell, and then I gave them the receipts, just so that everybody, so win-win for everybody. I win because research was corrected before it was even published. The students win because they did a good deed, they contributed to science. GiveWell can donate this money to people and save lives by giving mosquito nets and preventing people from attracting malaria. So I really believe in this. I like this kind of thing. If you're in a lab or you're doing a thesis, I really hope that you have something similar to this. Like in this lab, mistakes are expected, respected, inspected, corrected. So I feel like this should be the slogan of academia. We want to know if we are wrong. So doubt us, ask us questions, put the scientist hat, and hold us to higher standards than what our Nobel Prize winners and big names do. In addition, I try to communicate to my students in my guide lab that everything is open science and everything is transparent. And it's completely okay to make mistakes. It's part of the process. We're all human. Yeah, we need to facilitate a process that will achieve high probability of catching mistakes and learning from them. So if you do make a mistake, tell your collaborator, we admit and own our mistakes, and then we correct them and learn from them to do better in the future. I do not feel like Richard Thaler really learned something from this. I feel like he should go revisit many of the things that he has done, go and check who this Schiphol airport guy is, get the evidence, and share more about all of his research. So you saw that you messed up one thing, go and check your other research. You have 200 plus papers with more than 10 citations for you to check, right? Okay, before I go on with this, I'll give you a 5-minute break and then we'll discuss another case study with Dan Ariely. 5 minutes. So I don't want to discourage you from relying on default effects, because actually some of the default effects do work, but we do need to understand what works and what doesn't work. So aside from check me, replicate me, I just want to show you that I care about this. And I asked you last week the question that we asked Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman was saying to the social priming people, you should check yourself, you should do more replications, you should make sure that everything is solid. And then I asked Daniel Kahneman, but who is going to check behavioral economics and judgment decision making? And I told you very briefly, we are going to do this at HKU. So I'm going to just tell you very, very quickly, what is it that we did at HKU? So I decided when I was doing my postdoc that I'm going to emphasize open science and credibility and to make sure that everything is solid. And I did this by sharing all the materials, the data, the code, and so forth. But also I decided to do a lot of replications and a lot of meta-analysis and a lot of registered reports. And finally, I decided that I'm going to work with all of my courses. So the first 5 years that I was here at HKU, all of the courses that I gave, including judgment decision-making, worked together with me in order to conduct replications. So here you can see all of the people. So in all of my courses throughout the years, 390 students, 45 thesis students, and then joined us from around the world, 45 early career researchers from different countries, from all over the place, PhD students, postdocs, and so forth. How many of these replications did we do in judgment decision-making and social psychology? So we did over 150 of these classic effects, and some of them are about defaults. So many of these are pre-registered studies. Some of them, an increasing number, is registered reports, but we also did a bunch of other things. If you want, actually the team, the core team, the HKU students team has a Google Scholar. So we're even in Google Scholar, and you can see we don't come close to 200,000 citations, but you can see that we're increasing in impact and more get cited, not as cited as the big people, but we have already more than 45 publications. So this is an example for one of the publications. And as you can see here, all the names are HKU students. And actually Nadia, who took my course and did my thesis with me, proceeded to do her PhD here. And she's graduating next year, which is amazing. So she's here, she's around. We have 2 publications together, this one included. So what did we do the replication on? What did Nadia do the replication on? The default effect from 2003, the science paper. So we actually did this. So we manipulated the defaults, and you can see an example here. So yes, I want to be an organ donor. No, I don't want to be an organ donor. And then you can see the selection. So we changed this, and we did a replication of 2 classic studies. One is the 2003 science paper, and then another one from 2002. And quite amazing is that we found support for the default effect. What you can see here on the left are the original findings. Just going to close this. So these are the original findings. So opt-in and opt-out. We're not talking about country level. This is not the same one. This is individual level where we manipulate this in an experiment. So if we do opt-in and opt-out, there's a big difference, 42 to 82. So when Eric Johnson is referring to 50%, this is about the 50% that he's talking about. How about our replication? There is a difference between opt-in and opt-out, but it's a lot more humble. So 62 versus 74. So question about generalizability, very important. You need to run more and more of these replications. It could be that there is an effect, and in this case, we do find support for an effect, but there's variability. It's not 50% anymore. It's a lot more humble than this, right? So this is why it's important to do these kinds of replications. The problem is that the paper from 2002, we did not replicate successfully. So what that paper did is contrast what's called a framing effect, which we'll talk about, versus the default effects to see which one is stronger. And actually, we found in our samples that framing effect was much stronger than the default effect, which is the opposite from what they found in 2002. So sometimes things reverse. However, we're not the only ones to do this kind of replication. So I met in a conference last year, I think it was. Somebody also did a replication, and theirs was successful. They ran this in Germany, I think. So generalizability, we need to know, where does this work? What is the effect? To what extent, and so forth. So my advice to you is that even if you read something in an article, go and have a look at a replication. And not just any replication, preferably as a registered report or as a pre-registered plan that has complete open science. So in the tutorial that you'll get to watch, hopefully this weekend, you'll see the open science pyramid. So more open science practices means higher credibility. The more replications you have, higher credibility. The more independent replications, not by the same team, the more credible. So we'll be talking about some of these things. This is one other study that we did a replication of. I will not go into this, but when he was talking about sustainability, he was talking about this study, and he was showing the very high impact for sustainability about changing the default. So here it's about what choice of a light bulb to have. So they did this back then, and we decided to do this again. But things change since the 2000s. The types of light bulbs changed, so we had to make some adjustments. I won't bore you with all the details, but finally at the end, we make some adjustments, did all kinds of things, and finally at the end, we findings, we found support for the default effect and for the status quo effect. The one thing I just wanted to say, and these are all the that I just went through, is that we did this as a registered report. And this is very important. All the thesis students that work with me do their thesis as a registered report, which means that first they do a pre-registration plan. Then we take this pre-registration plan before data collection, and we send this to a journal where it has expert peer reviews by the community, by people who are prominent. And once everybody agrees on the plan, then we get something called an in-principle acceptance, which means that no matter what the outcome is, positive, negative, support, p-value, lower, higher than 0.05, it's going to get published. So registered reports are the future because they tackle outcome bias, publication bias, hindsight bias. So we did this as a registered report. This is the broken model of science of how most of the articles are done. But we did this using this two-stage peer review where everybody looks at the pre-registration, then you have an endorsement of the plan. Only then you continue to the data collection. And in the second round, the only thing that the reviewers do is look at whether you follow the plan, or if you deviated, that you documented this and justified this accordingly. So this is a much higher standard of open science, of rigor, of methods, and it takes care of a lot of problems in the scientific process. I won't go into this, but it clears all the outcome bias, hindsight bias, publication bias, and so forth. And all the peer review is open. Have you seen an article with open peer review? Very rare. What's nice about this platform and these registered reports is that all of the peer review is completely open. So you can see not only the kind of feedback that we got from the experts on the pre-registration plan, but you can also see how we reply to this. And you can see how we changed the manuscript to address this. So Monique here, Munding, did an amazing job, got an endorsement, got a publication out of this, and was able to replicate a classic study. So it's amazing that we were able to do this. The only difference between ours and theirs is, first of all, generalizability. So we tested this over time, so we had to adapt some of the things, and the effects are much more humble, are much smaller, right, than what it used to be before that. In addition to this, just to wrap up this part, we talked about the meta-analysis. And I told you very vaguely that maybe they have some problem where they didn't look at some studies. How do we know about this? We can do something called a publication bias assessment and adjustment. We have a statistical method that is able to estimate the number of unpublished findings or what the real effect is. I won't go into detail on how to do that. I'm going to give a meta-analysis workshop at HQ if you want. You're welcome to attend that. But we have statistical methods now in order to look at whether there's publication bias and then to adjust for it. 2 weeks ago, we had a visitor who gave a talk about this, and he's actually the one who did this. His name was Max Mayer. And this is now very well cited, like 200 citations, and he's just a PhD student. But he has what is called robust Bayesian meta-analysis method in order to look at publication bias. And then remember the wonderful graph about everything works. Look at what's happening here. Everything after publication bias adjustment, everything touches the null, which is quite amazing. And then finally, the conclusion here is that after adjusting for severe moderate degree of publication bias, the adjusted estimated effect size is no longer 0.68. It's going down to 0.08 to 0.31. So some things work a little bit, but definitely don't work all the time and don't always work with 0.68. So when you do a meta-analysis, just like what's suggested over there, look for what did they do? What kind of a meta-analysis was this? On what studies? And if you don't have access to these studies because people don't want to share with you because they're embarrassed with their rejections, then you have statistical methods to adjust for publication bias. So when you look at a meta-analysis, make sure that it has a publication bias assessment and adjustment, okay? And we only started doing this since 2015. So that means a meta-analysis from the last 9 years, okay? So there's a whole discussion about this. I won't go into this, but I use defaults now in order to get people to do more open science. So these are the takeaways. Please verify stuff. If a Nobel Prize winner tells you stuff about urinals, then just ask questions, okay? And then implement what it is that works based on caution and humility. All right, so we took down these two big books. We talked about that problematic chapter. We have one left with Dan Ariely. How about that one? So where to begin with Dan Ariely? Long, complicated story. Gosh, what has happened in the last 2 years? I don't even know where to start with this. I'll just start with this. So this is a book. I just copy-pasted a screenshot. And this talks about a famous study with the 10 Commandments. But I'll just say that this is based on this study about dishonesty. It's always interesting when there's some stuff about dishonesty regarding a paper with dishonesty. So it cannot get more ironic than that. But you can see here how many citations? 3,908 citations. Millions of dollars spent around the world to change policy, including Obama administration, to change things based on this specific paper. The dishonesty of honest people, how to get people to be more honest. So this is a paper from 2008, very highly cited. So as I show you, Dan Ariely explaining these things, please put the scientist hat on, ask questions, and tell me, what is it that you want to know about what he's explaining? And I should just say about Dan Ariely, because he has a very interesting life story, and I admit that I have a lot of sympathy for him, and I admire him as a communicator. So he's not only a prolific researcher, but he knows how to communicate fine. He is very interesting and engaging, and he's very knowledgeable. His life story is that he got burned. He got burned very, very severely when he was 16, 17, and half of his body was, as a result of that, so burned, have to change the skin and all. So basically, half of his body, including his face, has some distortions. Plus, if you look at some of the latest from Dan Ariely, you see that his face always has half a beard, because half of his face he cannot grow a beard. And this is part of his personality. So because of that, this is what got him into judgment and decision-making and behavioral economics, because he wanted to understand cognitive biases and why things hurt more than they should have when he was at a hospital for about 3 years. So ask yourself, with the story, with everything that he's talking about, what is going on? What do we want to know?
Now, how would you test a personal fudge factor? Initially, we said, what can we do to shrink the fudge factor? So we got people to the lab and we said...
Fudge factor is how much people fudge, how much they change, over-report in order to get some money. So he runs experiments where he tests whether people are honest and not honest, and then he shows that people tend to over-report in order to get more money, and he calls this the fudge factor. All kinds of things where people rationalize why they're cheating in order to get more money. So he wants to decrease the fudge factor. How do we shrink it?
We have two tasks for you today. First, we asked half the people to recall either 10 books they read in high school or to recall the 10 Commandments. And then we tempted them with cheating. Turns out the people who tried to recall the 10 Commandments, and in our sample nobody could recall the 10 Commandments, but those people who tried to recall the 10 Commandments, given the opportunity to cheat, did not cheat at all. It wasn't that the more religious people, the people who remembered more of the commandment, cheated less, and the less religious people, the people who couldn't remember almost any commandment, cheated more. The moment people thought about trying to recall the 10 Commandments, they stopped cheating. In fact, even when we give self-declared atheists the task of swearing on the Bible and we give them a chance to cheat, they don't cheat at all. Now, 10 Commandments is something that is hard to bring into the education system, so we said, why don't we get people to sign the honor code? So we got people to sign. I understand that this short survey falls under the MIT honor code. Then they shredded it, no cheating whatsoever. And this is particularly interesting because MIT doesn't have an honor code.
So very interesting. I hope you got it. That if you recall the 10 Commandments or you sign that you are pledged by the honor code, the MIT that does not exist, then cheating is reduced to zero, to nothing. People do not cheat anymore. And actually, I admit that when I was giving courses during my PhD and I had courses and I wanted students not to teach on their exam, I did this and I asked them to sign the honor code for HKUST, and there is no honor code for HKUST. I don't know how this reduced because it's not an experiment, but I use this as a policy in my classes, hoping that it will reduce and students will cheat less in my exams. So we have a lot of questions to ask. One of them is, would it replicate? And this is a good question to ask because it's not so easy to understand what it is that they did over there, but somebody took this very big task of trying to run this. So here it says protocol vetted by Dan Ariely and Ina Mazar and On Amir. So they went over the protocol and they said, yes, this is how we did this, and you should go ahead and run this in various places around the world. And here you can see all of the labs that ran this. So the original result had a Cohen's d of 1.45, which is quite unreasonable, very, very large effect. How about all the other labs? So you can see over here, most of them, yeah, this does not touch the null. You can see 0.01, but almost all of them touch the null. And this one is actually going in the other direction. And finally, when you aggregate all of these touching the null to what is it at the end, it goes in the opposite direction but it overlaps with the null. So basically there is no effect. So all these people over here, millions of dollars spent, a lot of researcher money, time, in order to try and replicate this. A study from 2008 that has got a lot of people to change their policies and what it is that they did, right? So you can already ask yourself, so we've got this study from 2008, Dan Ariely, prominent, irrational, predictably irrational book, and so forth. And then we've got all these replicators, people like me, nobodies, that run these in places around the world with their students. Which one would you trust more? So one of the things you might want to ask yourself is, okay, so what did they have to say about this? And here you can see some of it's a little bit small, so I'll just read this out to you. We're humbled and thankful. Already a lot better than Richard Thaler. Very good. Thank you for doing this and hope to continue learning from the results. However, unfortunately, the rules for the current grand replication attempt were stricter and did not allow for such flexibilities that would generate a conceptual replication, at least within the individual labs. So they said, you did this wrong. You should have done something differently. And then it's just very puzzling because you vetted the protocol. You were involved in every step of the way. You cannot come afterwards with outcome bias and say this failed, therefore it's not any good. You were there. If you wanted to do something differently, you should have. Now millions have been wasted. If there's really a mistake in there, it's partially your mistake. So interesting reaction from this team. Don't really know what to make of this. But people pushed back on this. And this is actually one of the big statistics people who is involved in open science. And I really like the way that he framed this. Another way of putting it is this. Dan Ariely's book is called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and this is the second book that he had after Predictably Irrational. And I assume Ariely was honest while writing this book. That is, he's expressing the sincerely held views. But honesty are not enough. Honesty is also transparency. Have you been transparent about everything along the way? Have you shared everything? Did you do the best that you can in order to make sure that this is robust and replicable and so forth? So I like him calling out, especially if you care about honesty, you should uphold higher standards of that. Like there's a website. I do not recommend that you join this website, but this is where we run rumors in academia about each other. It's not good to go there. A lot of rumors, and people started to have all kinds of rumors about this stuff, and they also share emails. So people started sharing all kinds of emails about Dan Ariely suddenly, after this replication attempt, contacting the person who allegedly ran the study, asking them, there's some questions about the study. Can you please share the data? And some of the emails back, you cannot read this. Later, you can download the slides. The people said, what are you talking about? We never ran the study for you. So suddenly it's becoming unclear who ran the study? If Dan Ariely did not run the study and he thought that somebody else ran the study, and then they ask him for the data in the protocol, and the person who has allegedly ran the study does not know that they ran the study, then what you should take away from this? Who is responsible for this? And come on, before you run the millions of the 20 labs from around the world, then, before that, then look for stuff, not after this whole thing started. This is in Hebrew. I speak Hebrew, so I'll translate this to you. This became public. So they asked Dan Ariely, hey, the woman says she never collected the data for you. She doesn't know what you're talking about. The study has never been conducted. Whose data did you report? So I translated this for you. The experiment took place over 15 years ago. I do not know why she remembers things in the way that she described them to you. At first, she did not remember taking part in the study at all, and only later she recalled, I and the 2 other professors who did the study remember the details exactly as they are described in the article. That's just not honest, because we see the emails in this horrible website of rumors. So I don't know why he's reacting this way. This does not make any sense. And actually, in Israel, because Dan Ariely is a big name, there were a lot of investigative reporting trying to understand who did the study, was there a study, what happened, and then they found all sorts of other things about Dan Ariely. Unbelievable. This happened today. This is from today, Twitter today. Expression of concern. The journal decided that they're going to put a public notice on this article to say, we tried to ask them where the data comes from, who ran the study, and they don't have basic answers for that. In addition to this, they realized that some conditions were dropped from some of the experiments without disclosure. We call this questionable research practices. Who does this kind of stuff? I don't really understand, especially if the study that you're doing is about honesty. I don't get it. Information regarding the provenance of one of the data reported in experiment 1 was inconsistent. This is a very nice way to say, we have no idea what happened there. We don't know who did the data, who ran the study, where did this thing came from. This should not be an expression of concern. This should be a retraction, but this is just from today. Let's take this a step further, just so we understand this is the beginning of a slippery slope.
We went to UCLA and we asked about 500 students to try and recall the 10 commandments. By the way, none of them could. It was interesting by itself. They made up all kind of new commandments. But after just trying to remember the 10 commandments, we gave them the same task in which they could cheat. What happened? Nobody cheated. Now, it wasn't as if the people who remembered many commandments didn't cheat and the people who remembered a few commandments cheated. Nobody cheated. That basically suggests that once you get people to consider their own moral code, we basically kind of reduce the flexibility by which we could justify all kinds of moral behavior. We ran a similar experiment, by the way, with a big insurance company. The only thing we did was we changed the line on the signature. Usually in insurance form, you fill the insurance form and you sign at the bottom. By the time people sign at the bottom, they finish cheating. It's over. Right? So we changed the line and we got people to sign up front. Turns out people cheat much less when they first sign.
I think this is a small thing. It's not a small thing. A lot of governments change their tax forms, and this is millions of dollars. In order to tell you think it's simple to change tax forms, it's really not. In order to move the signature from the end to the beginning, because Dan Ariely had a study on this. And this is actually a very, very prominent study by big names. So Dan Ariely is just one of 3 very big names. Francesca Gino, Harvard professor, very prolific. Max Bazerman, one of the big names in judgment decision-making, who wrote the book on judgment decision-making. I use a lot of his studies. So they published this in a very big journal called PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they found that if you get people to sign at the beginning rather than at the end, they report things more honestly. And the one with the insurance company that he refers to is the third study. And the third study is they found a difference in that people reported higher mileage. So the thing is that if you report higher mileage, you need to pay more insurance premium because you drive more often, right? And when people signed at the beginning, they reported driving more miles, therefore having more insurance premium, therefore considered to be more ethical. Great studies. You both have experiments and you have field studies. So this is a good supplement with one another. And this is included in a lot of policy recommendations that were implemented by various countries from around the world. So you need to do all sorts of things, and people did this with compliance and handicap parking and a bunch of other stuff. What's interesting is that after a while, after about 10 years, some of the governments came back and said, we've implemented this, wasted millions on this, but we don't see any change in how people pay their taxes. So what's up with that? So something amazing happened, and it doesn't happen very often with big names and with journals like PNAS. They did a replication of their own study, and they came to the conclusion that signing at the beginning versus at the end does not decrease dishonesty. This is great. This is how science should progress, right? You had a finding, you said something, everybody changed policy. Now you realize maybe not so great. So you issue another article with a replication, better power, more participants, and then you realize. Now, the ironic thing about this replication, it's a win for open science. It's a win for everything. This is how science should progress. However, when they did the replication, they were asked to share all of their data and their code, and they did. But they also shared all of the data in the code from the previous one. And this is when things started to go very, very wrong. So they came to the conclusion that this is a false positive and everything is okay. And then Max Bazerman, in his book, Better Not Perfect, says, we ran a replication, we didn't find anything. But then this happened. There's a group that's called Data Colada. And this group, Data Colada, looks at evidence for fraud. And they came out with a blog post that shows beyond any doubt that the third study with the insurance company is fraud. So I'll give you just one example for one of the things that they did. They said, typically when people report their mileage, you see this nice distribution, like a bell curve. But in the studies over there, you just got this like very straight line, and then suddenly it drops at 50,000. Something here is very, very wrong. Saying, oh, wow, this does not look good, but you cannot say that this is fraud. Maybe it's just like something went wrong over there. But to make things worse, they found other things. Like, for example, in the data set, it seems like people change stuff. And how do you know that they change stuff? Because they used a different font. So somebody was so stupid in how they did fraud is that in the places where things were changed, they used a different font that looks a little bit like the other font, but a different font. So they were able to trace. Also, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Excel actually saves the changes that you've made since it was created. So they were able to look at the Excel and look at who did the changes and look at the changes that were done in order to see the raw data at the beginning and then what happened at the end, and then to see that somebody changes in the right direction in order to show the effect. There's no doubt whatsoever. Everybody agrees that there was fraud here. Question is, who did the fraud? So a lot of questions. So the researchers came out with this. So this is Lisa Shu here, writing all kinds of things. So immediately each one of the authors is like, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. So here, for example, did we request to scrutinize each other's databases at the time? No. Did Shu, Gino, Bazerman, did ever see, touch, Ariely, Mazar field experiment data? No. We began our collaboration in good faith. So they're saying, no, us, the Gino group, we had nothing to do with the Dan Ariely group. So 5 authors, 3 versus 2, it's them. We should have verified this, but we don't verify anything as academics. We just assume that everything is okay. Oh my gosh, she did not understand the kind of hole that she was bearing for herself. Fast forward a bunch of stuff. This is Max Bazerman, and he's reflecting about this whole story. I'm not going to play the video. I'm going to save this. If you want, you can watch this later. He actually wrote a whole book about this saga called Complicit, and he was saying, it's my fault. I did not check. I did not ask questions. I just received the data, and I put my name on it. Unfortunately, in academia, we do this quite a lot. We don't check the data that we have, in the articles that we have our names on. We just assume, some days with students, some days with lab managers, some days with collaborators from the other side of the world. It's like, okay, they found something. We want credit, and we want to publish an article, and we want our names with Bazerman. So we say, yeah, please add me to the article. And he says, no, it's my fault. I did not check this. But it goes much, much, much further than this. So finally, this was retracted. No expression of concern. The article was retracted. This is a big deal to retract this kind of thing. And this is what Dan Ariely for a very long time didn't say much about this. But here I was able to find at least one podcast where he talks about this. And this is what he wrote on his website just from this year. It's been a while. That turns out that Duke University had a whole investigation about this and then found that Dan Ariely didn't do anything wrong. And this is what he
Last time we talked, I caught you off guard a little bit when I asked you about the car insurance study. And of course, we were talking about misbelief, which is something I'm interested in.
You did not catch me off guard. It was just not the right time to ask these questions. Right. So it's not that I wasn't happy to talk about it, but I wanted the Duke investigation to finish before I can talk about it. So this is why we're here.
Okay. I almost want you to just clarify the situation regarding the insurance company's data. And from your point of view, I think you gave me an answer, but just kind of a second shot.
So clearly something very bad went wrong in the chain of custody. This happened in 2007, 2008, and something very bad happened, and this was under my watch. And I have some responsibility because it was under my watch. But if you ask the question of did I ever manipulate or change data, and the answer is no.
So he says this is the insurance company. And then you want to ask, like, why would the insurance company do this? I also don't know why he would do this, because by then he was very prominent and sold like already 6 startups and he's a millionaire. Like, why would he need this one article? So just this whole story doesn't make sense. We don't really know who did the fraud. But this is not, to me, the right kind of reaction. What is the right kind of reaction? Check me, replicate me. Okay, so I found one. Maybe all my other 200 studies have this kind of thing. Maybe now I need to spend a lot of money and encourage others in order to check me. Just defending and saying, this is not me, I don't know what happened, some insurance company did this. This is not the right kind of... Let's say that you're really honest and this is not your fault. You have so many other papers, maybe check those as well. And this is not the first one. You already see another one that was there that is now expression of concern. So it's not the first study that has issues with it. So come on, man. What are you waiting for? This is not what we expect of our academics, especially if you study dishonesty. Now, we're not going to go into all of this, but I just collected a bunch. If you want to go into this, there's like a bunch of stories that came out of this. So I collect these headlines. Some of this is in Hebrew from Israel. Some of this is international media. When they started to do what Dan Ariely was supposed to do and go over all of these studies, oh my gosh, the stuff that keeps coming up. It's just like unbelievable. And a lot of people don't know, a lot of people collaborated with Dan Ariely and they don't know what to do with this. So now when I see stuff that comes from Dan Ariely, I really want to believe this, but I will not believe this until I see a registered report replication with a lot of, the open data and a lot of labs from around the world. I just don't take, so what? It was, predictably irrational on a TED Talk. So what? So this is just like one example. He also has a study where he gave students laptops in order to go home and masturbate. And people are like, what did you do? Somebody gave an ethical approval for this? So you watched them do this, or with the webcam? Like, what happened exactly with this masturbation study? And it's not just Dan Ariely. It's also, there's another very prominent researcher. So we asked George Lowenstein, so what happened with the masturbation study? And he says, I don't know. The whole data came from Dan Ariely. He had this cool idea, and this cool data. I just added my name to it. What happened there? Can you tell us what the protocol was, what the data is? No information whatsoever. So this is just like another one of the 200 studies and the stuff that's on predictably irrational. I'll just end with this. Francesca Gino. And this is so sad, I don't even know how to begin with this. So remember the 5 authors? 3 authors went against the 2. So the 3 authors that said, oh, we had nothing to do with them, they did fraud, we didn't do fraud. Turns out that of the 3 studies in PNAS, the car insurance study was number 3. The 2 other studies also had fraud. Who ran these studies? Francesca Gino did, from the 3. How do we know? Because Data Colada, the same group, found that also... Just so happens that in the same PNAS paper, 2 different groups committed fraud or had fraudulent data that published together. Just an unbelievable story. What did Francesca Gino do? First of all, I have to say there was a 2-year investigation by Harvard University. And at the end, she was put on administrative leave, which basically means that she cannot get fired because she has tenure. This basically means that she's like out of Harvard University. And because her entire career is built on this and she has a lot of books, a lot of TED Talks, and she's very, very prominent, she had to fight back. How did she fight back? She sued Harvard and she sued Data Colada. And we were very worried because we do this kind of work. We check stuff, we run replications. So if every time we find all kinds of stuff, somebody's going to sue us, this is a big problem. So we had a crowdfunding in order to help Data Colada to fight in court. And luckily, last month, the courts in the US dismissed Francesca Gino's claim and said that there's Data Colada did good, honest scientific work. And now she needs to pay, but it costs a lot of money, 2 years of lawyers they need to fund. And of course, a lot of anxious people, Data Colada team. But it's more than that. A lot of issues came out with Francesca Gino. So it's not just Dan Ariely, not Francesca Gino. Hundreds of papers, all of her co-authors now doubt her. So I'll show you a very quick video. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to summarize with this message. My main aim here is not to tell you that everything we do is fraud, and I think this is a very small minority. But I do want us to take very seriously the credibility of evidence and what we do here in academia. What I expect from the big names in our field, from the Nobel Prize winners, for people who write the book, even if you are not the one who committed the fraud, you do not react in this way. You take things seriously. You check your stuff. You open everything up. When you talk to people online, you respect them and thank them for criticism. You engage in it. You check yourself all the time. If something happens and you find something, be transparent about this. Go and check everything else. Stop everything you're doing and check yourself. Don't go and sue the people who help you find this. They're doing this out of their own pocket, out of their own time, in order to help you in the scientific community clean up the act. When people do replications, it's not because they're out to get you. It's because they want to make sure that when people follow these books that you published and they paid for, both with the research funding and to just pay for the book, that they actually implement right policy, that they don't waste millions and years in order to pursue something that just doesn't exist. So our role in this course is to look at cognitive biases and what happens when we evaluate scientific evidence. We want to make sure what is solid, what is not solid. So I just want to give you an example that even people who we aspire to be, people who we look up to, the Nobel Prize winners, the professors, we need to uphold higher standards of open science transparency in order to uphold the truth. Okay? So I'll just very briefly summarize this with Francesca Gino, and I'll let you go.
It's time for us to once again talk about former Harvard professor Francesca Gino. And the reason is because the folks at Data Colada have recently released a blog post claiming that they have proof that Gino manipulated her work in exactly the way that they suspected, thanks to the now public Harvard internal report. If you don't know what I'm talking about, or you don't remember the context for this, let me give you a very high-level overview. Francesca Gino was a top professor at Harvard University. She was a professor of behavioral science, which is also my specialty. She was accused of faking her data in 4 different studies by these 3 guys who run a blog called Data Colada. Data Colada brought these suspicions to Harvard University, who then ran their own internal investigation. And as you can see on this Ground News headline, the Harvard Business School investigation report recommended firing Francesca Gino. They found that yes, Francesca Gino had indeed manipulated her data and recommended firing her as a result. You're in what the dean of Harvard University, this guy, Dean Data, did. He put her on administrative leave without pay. After this happens, Data Colada released 4 different blog posts, each one pertaining to a different study which they have evidence of fraud in. These 4 blog posts go crazy viral. News outlets all over the world are reporting on it. And as a result, Francesca Gino decides to sue both Data Colada and Harvard University for defamation. And as many of you will know, this was for a headline-grabbing $25 million. Now, when this story first broke, before the lawsuit even happened, I released a video covering the first 3 blog posts by Data Colada. And that video...
So now he goes into the 4th one. I'm going to stop it here because we're out of time. But I encourage you to go and check some of these links to see how Dana Ariely and Francesca Gino reacted to this whole thing and how this unfolded. I'm very glad that both in the case of Dana Ariely and Francesca Gino, we got closer to the truth and the case was dismissed against the people who actually do the good work. So go home, think about this, read about this a little bit more, and then I hope that in future classes we can discuss a little bit more. But what is credible? How do we know that something is credible? Meta-analysis with publication bias adjustments, replication, and asking a lot of questions with open data, open science as much as possible. I'll see you next week.